to have that from a political standpoint as well as from others as well, due to the fact that it seemed to me as the campaign was developing that that might become an issue. What I'm referring to is that as I saw the Bay of Pigs, the Bay of the well, start again. I felt it was important that with all the attacks we were going to be subjected to during the campaign, that we have a report as to what happened in the Bay of Pigs, and the other report that I wanted was on the bombing halt that was negotiated by President Johnson and the terms of that bombing halt. I felt we had to have all the facts with regard to how those particular events were developed.
I think we've come to the end of our hour. A little digression there.
Yeah, I wonder.
Well, we'll see. Got the film of you with Castro, so we'll use that in the leaders section.
Yeah.
And we want to cover the Bay of Pigs for the 66.
But then tomorrow, then we'll come around to, in view of all that, what
The alert and the actual, the war
Of course,
itself.
but you have 74 Summit where he he said that he didn't do it, didn't support the Israelis. He tried to restrain them and all that sort of thing. Do you want to get that in today or not? Well, we'll see.
Let's see.
See how it
Yeah.
goes.
Frank,
Because that
are we
was in
starting
there.
a new subject that would require a live shot, or should we just come up to you on the tight shot?
Let's, no, just a tight shot.
Okay, we'll come on camera one. Stand by.
All right, here we go. 212.
13 years after your meeting with Khrushchev in the Kremlin, you were back as President of the United States for a meeting with Khrushchev's successor, Brezhnev. What were your impressions of Leonid Brezhnev as you walked into his office?
Well, naturally, I was thinking perhaps of how he differed from Khrushchev, because it was exactly the same office and the same table there, bare, no particular paintings or anything on the wall, nothing distinctive at all about it. But the men were quite different.
How did they differ?
Well, first let me say how they did not differ, because that's just as important. They were both dedicated communists. They were both ruthless. They were both very tough, as I've often pointed out. In communist countries, the weak never get to the top. Sometime you may elect in a free country a weak person, but in that jungle, it's dog eat dog, and only the fittest survive at the top. And so it was with Brezhnev. He was a tough, ruthless leader, just as was Khrushchev before him. There were differences, however. As I talked to Brezhnev, I found that while he was intelligent, he was not nearly as quick as Khrushchev. He was not nearly as unpredictable, although at times he could be pretty tricky as well. But he was a little more obvious about it than Khrushchev. He didn't have Khrushchev's scintillating sense of humor. He had a sense of humor, but Khrushchev could just move from one thing to another very fast. He dropped off proverbs practically every 2 or 3 minutes. He always had colorful phrases, which Brezhnev seldom had. I remember whenever Khrushchev in our talks would say that this or that or the other thing wouldn't be agreed to by the Soviet Union, and that wasn't going to happen. He said that isn't going to happen until a shrimp learns to whistle, or until you can see your ears without a mirror. You didn't hear Brezhnev talking that way. His humor was a little more obvious. I would say one other thing about the Khrushchev-Brezhnev difference is that while Khrushchev would at times be somewhat even vulgar, Brezhnev was crude at times, but not to the point of Khrushchev, not in an embarrassing way. He was just earthy, like Lyndon Johnson. I never thought of Lyndon Johnson as being a vulgar man. He never was, but he was an earthy man. And Brezhnev was very much like Johnson in that respect. And like him in another respect, very physical. He was a grabber. He'd always grab you when he wanted to make a point, either by the knee or by the arm. Incidentally, speaking of Johnson's tendency to do that, I recall President Eisenhower having a go with Jerry Persons, who succeeded Sherman Adams as chief of staff. Persons told me about this later. And he said that President Eisenhower, had agreed to see the then majority leader of the Senate, Johnson. Johnson was coming into the Oval Office, and Eisenhower wasn't feeling too well that day, and he said, well, I'll agree to see him, Jerry, but on one condition. You stand between him and me at the desk, because I don't want him to grab my arm. My bursitis is kicking up. And he would have had to say that with Brezhnev, because Brezhnev was a grabber as well. All in all, another point I should make is that I think Brezhnev was more cautious than Khrushchev. Khrushchev was more imaginative, more creative. As a matter of fact, in a way, a more interesting person, but in a way also, in the short term, more dangerous. Maybe not in the long term. Brezhnev probably was just as dangerous because he was more cautious. But in the short term, Khrushchev could be counted upon to do something risky, something impulsive, like, for example, putting missiles into Cuba. I do not think that Brezhnev would have done that. That's the difference between the two and what they would do.
What, do you have an example of the difference between earthiness and crudity?
Well, as far as as Khrushchev's conversation was concerned, I've already indicated the confrontation we had when I first went into the office, and we compared the different kinds of manure, horse and pig for that matter. I don't think you would have seen Brezhnev do that.
The first night in Moscow, they gave a very grand banquet for you in the Kremlin. Do you remember that night?
Oh, very well. I had just met with Brezhnev in his office. And it had been a pretty testy go, although not nearly as testy as was the case with Khrushchev 13 years earlier. Brezhnev was very respectable. And incidentally, this brings me to another fundamental point between the difference between not only the men but their times. Khrushchev had a definite inferiority complex because his country was weaker. He knew that. By the time we met with Brezhnev, that inferiority was gone. He didn't have to constantly huff and puff and brag in a bellicose way as Khrushchev had. And that made for a much better, more, I would say, forthcoming discussion than would have been otherwise, although it was pretty tough at times. Well, we went into this beautiful room. It's in the Kremlin, and we have to remember the Kremlin was the religious center of the Tsarist Russia as well as the political center. In fact, it was primarily the religious center. And I recall we were sitting at this beautiful table, Brezhnev opposite me, and behind him was a magnificent mural, a 15th century mural of Christ and the Apostles at the Last Supper. And Brezhnev noticed me looking at it, and he said, you know, that was the Politburo of those times. And I looked at it, and I said, well, that would seem to indicate that you, the General Secretary, and the Pope have a great deal in common. He laughed. He usually responded to humor very well. Incidentally, I was almost tempted to ask him who was the Judas of the day, but I thought better of it and didn't.
He might have responded by asking you how many battalions the Pope had.
That's right.
This first summit produced two major agreements, the anti-ballistic missile agreement and the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, the SALT Treaty. You have said that a leader shouldn't go to a summit unless he knows exactly what's going to come out of it. How much did you know that these agreements were going to come out of this summit, or how much negotiation actually was left to do face-to-face between you and Brezhnev?
Well, first I should point out that we had negotiated at a distance through our representatives long before that, and I knew what was going on every bit of the way. Henry Kissinger conducted those negotiations with great skill and great brilliance and great tenacity, and of course he had gone to the Soviet Union and met for 4 days with Brezhnev, nailing down some of the final agreements. So the negotiations had taken place, but not face-to-face. When we got face-to-face, we assumed, or I assumed, that all we would do would be pretty much to put our signatures on the final product, which had already been prepared. But there were a few loose ends left to work out. Well, for example, with regard to the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the Soviet Union had an ABM system around Moscow. And we, of course, were just building one, or started to build one as a result of winning by only 1 vote in the Senate an ABM system for the United States that we were going to put around some of our Minutemen sites.
What is an ABM system?
An ABM means an anti-ballistic missiles. It will shoot down incoming missiles. And they wanted to protect Moscow, which is their command center from which they order strikes from around the whole world. In any event, the critical question there was how close or how far away the missiles should be, the ABM system, I should say, should be from Moscow. And it had been a point of contention because we wanted it as far away from Moscow as possible. But they wanted it closer in. And so under the circumstances then, as we were talking, Brezhnev said to me, well, it is our understanding that what we have agreed to is that these missiles be, our ABM system be 1,200 kilometers from Moscow. And I knew that wasn't right, and I said 1,500. He said, no, I thought it was 1,200, and I said 1,500. He says, all right, it's 1,200. All right, it's 1,500. No, I'm sorry. Let's start again. He said, it's our understanding that we are to put our ABM system 1,200 miles from Moscow. And I said, no, that's not correct. What I understand we've agreed to is 1,500 miles. He said, why 1,500 miles? Do you want us to put it in the Urals? And I said, no, it's my understanding 1,500 miles. And then he just dropped it like that. Okay, 1,500 is all right. And I remember Henry Kissinger passed me a little note. He said this whole summit was worth that one interchange. In any event, Brezhnev was trying, of course, to slip a fast one by us, but thanks to Kissinger's good preparation and my being briefed fairly well on it, we were able to say no. We hardlined it, and he took the 1,500.
There was another...
And there was another interplay, incidentally, with regard to the offensive weapons. You understand the ABM treaty, the defensive weapons was one part of it. That became a treaty, and that was permanent. And on the other hand, the offensive limitation was a temporary one. It was to be for 5 years. That is what I had understood would be the agreement that the Russians had worked out with Kissinger at the second level. And when we came to that discussion, Brezhnev all of a sudden said, why don't we make it 10 years? And Kissinger immediately stepped into the conversation. He said, look, he said, we only agreed to 5 years. We both did because you only wanted 18 months. And now we have 5 years. The reason, incidentally, we didn't want to go to 10 years was that we couldn't be in a position of in effect, freezing ourselves into any position that would be inferior to the Russians. In 5 years, we had to determine whether we were going to get control on their offensive weapons, which were moving up much faster than ours.
Aren't we inferior to them now?
In land-based missiles, yes. Not overall. Overall, we're ahead in the sea, we're ahead in the air, But the land-based missiles are the heaviest, they're the most accurate, they're the most decisive. They're frankly the key to any nuclear strategy.
Why do
They're
they,
the only ones that have a first strike capability.
why do they adopt this kind of negotiating tactics? Because if something had been agreed on beforehand, and in a negotiation the difference between 1,200 and 1,500 were transposed, couldn't you come back and say, even if you had agreed to something unexpectedly, couldn't you come back and say that in all the negotiations beforehand this was simply a misspeaking? Or does the President have the power to actually make an irreversible commitment in a negotiation like that one-on-one?
Oh, certainly the President has the power, without any question.
Could you not come
And
back
so,
and say,
and so did he have the power. I think the reason they did that was that they were simply testing me. They were trying to see how badly I wanted to deal. They had probably tried it out on Kissinger earlier, and he said, well, no, I can't, because I cannot without consulting the President. He was always very good at doing that. And so they made a run at me, basically an appeal to the highest court. And when they found that I took exactly the same line, they backed down. They probe every place they can, and as Lenin used to say, he said, probe with bayonets. He said, if you find mush, proceed. If you find steel, withdraw. And in this case, they found steel, so they withdrew.
Another trip to a dacha was planned as part of the summit activities. Was it the same one that Khrushchev had taken you to?
Exactly the same one, the same river, everything. We went at a different time of day, however. We had just finished a very long day of negotiations, and we were scheduled to go out there a little later that night for dinner. And as we finished our discussions, Brezhnev grabbed me by the arm as we went into the elevator, and he says, look, he says, I want you to see the Moscow countryside in the daytime, because he knew, of course, that we had gone out the previous time to spend the night. And so we got into his limousine. The Secret Service were practically petrified because they weren't with us, and we took off at about 100 a mile clip down the middle of the Moscow roads, with all of the people, of course, the other people in the private cars off to the side, and we went out to the dacha. When we got there, he showed me around, as I, of course, recalled exactly how it looked before, and it was very interesting. They had me stay, incidentally, in the same bedroom. It's an interesting thing. The Chinese and the Russians are very different, but they tend to go with the same ploy with regard to physical arrangements. For example, in 1972, I stayed in a fine guest house in Peking. When I came back in 1976, they had me in exactly the same guest house, and Mrs. Nixon and I came back. In this case, we went there in 1972, and we had exactly the same dacha that we had had for 13 years before. And the same was true, incidentally, with regard to our Kremlin suite. The magnificent Kremlin suite, which Brezhnev had shown me as we came in 1972, the one that was made available to us then, exactly the same one, right down to the caviar and the cucumbers on the dining room table that we had in 1972. It was there in 1974.
Were the hidden microphones the same?
Well, as far as the microphones are concerned, we always assumed that they were there. And incidentally, we assumed that they were in China. I had a practice in that time, in 72, 73, 74, of dictating into my Sony dictator my recollections at the end of a day. In order to do that, I turned on what we call a scrambler, and it makes a lot of noise and so forth, which scrambles it so that the microphones, which are usually, we assume, up in the ceiling or perhaps in the phone or something like that, couldn't pick it up. Consequently, when my secretary, years later, had to transcribe some of that, it was a little difficult to hear it because of the scrambler. If you have any doubt about it, however, one of the White House secretaries who was on that trip told me of a very amusing incident thereafter. She just happened to casually, as she went in one day for lunch and saw all the cucumbers and the other fine things that they served around there, and said, you know, gee, I'd really wish I could get an apple. And about 10 minutes later, in walked a maid very noiselessly and put a whole basket of apples right on the table for her.
Wasn't there a story about Kissinger wanting to get Xeroxed copies of something?
Yes, well, this Kissinger's meeting with Gromyko, and he told me about this later with great glee, because Henry has a very good sense of humor. He's a very serious negotiator, but he's got a sharp sense of humor, and he uses it effectively. And he said he and Gromyko were talking, and Gromyko, when he saw this piece of paper that they were discussing that Henry had brought along, he said he'd like to have copies. And so Henry took the piece of paper and held it up to the chandelier and said, 6 copies, please.
At this first Moscow summit as president, just as Khrushchev had taken you out on the Moscow River for a boat ride, didn't Brezhnev do the same thing?
Yes, in this case, he took me, however, in a hydrophil. That was the new kind of boat that they had, and he was very, very proud of it. He kept pointing to the thermometer. He was very proud of it. He kept pointing to the speedometer, which would show us going at around 60 to 75 kilometers an hour, which would mean about 40 knots, which is real fast. You know, it gets up above the water and just sails right along. I was glad there were no sunken logs rising to the surface at that point. And
were there any swimmers that time?
This time, no ploy like that, because there had been no discussion of captive peoples. Oh, we had one little interesting interchange. I recall I asked him about the Moscow River because I had remembered the swimmers from before, and I said, did he ever swim? He says, oh, no. He says, I prefer to swim down on the Black Sea. The water is much warmer. Here, it's much colder, and it gets you right here, and he pointed to his groin. He pointed to his groin.
At the in your meetings with Khrushchev at the dacha, he gave you that eerie nuclear workover over luncheon. Were you treated any better by Brezhnev and his comrades in 1972?
Only in the sense that we were treated very, very toughly, but privately. See, the Khrushchev treatment was rather interesting because the wives were there, Mrs. Nixon and Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Brezhnev and so forth and so on. And they sat there as spectators, eyes agog and so forth and so on, as anybody would. In this case, however, we were going up to dinner. The dinner was to be held later, and this we were preparing to go up to dinner. And what happened was that before dinner, Brezhnev suggested that we should have a little talk. So we went into a room, and here I was confronted on the other side of the table with Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny being the president of the Soviet Union, at least insofar as his title was concerned. And Kissinger, of course, was on our side and one of his associates. And then for 3.5 hours, they just pummeled me on Vietnam. One would talk, and then another would talk, and then another would take up the cudgels. And when either Brezhnev or Podgorny had the floor, let me start again. One would talk and then the other and so forth. I'll take that sequence again. They just pummeled me with arguments. First one would talk, and then another would talk, and then another one. And sometimes all of them talked at once. It just reminded me of the scrambler we had back in the hotel room, or I should say in the room at the Kremlin, in our apartment there. And on occasion, when Podgorny had the floor, or when Kosygin had the floor, Brezhnev would get up and pace the floor. That was something he did quite often. He'd get up and pace the floor. Like Douglas MacArthur used to pace the floor on occasion when he got very, involved in a subject. Matter of fact, Brezhnev used to tell Kissinger on occasion, he said, every time I stand up, I make another concession. That was a slight overstatement, incidentally, but he made good use of it. But the whole thrust of it was to take me on there on the issue of Vietnam. So you have to lay the groundwork there. We went to Moscow 3 weeks after bombing and mining the Hanoi-Haiphong complex. And we thought when that decision was made that there was a very good chance that we would never go at all. In fact, right after the decision was made, Henry said there was only a 10% chance that they would not call off the summit. The next day he raised it to 20, and the following day to 30, and then we were all, frankly, relieved and somewhat surprised that they finally raised no objection at all, and we went. But in any event, here they were getting in their licks on Vietnam. And one point that was made during the course of the conversation, I remember it was Podgorny, who is the nominal president of the Soviet Union, was saying, we don't understand, an international opinion does not understand how you could possibly support an unelected leader of South Vietnam. And I said, who elected the leader of North Vietnam? He said, all the people. I says, go ahead. But the point was made. And then on another occasion, when Kosygin had taken it up, he's a little bit more subtle than either Brezhnev than Podgorny. Certainly the most intelligent overall of the three. But he made the point, he said, in the event that the United States continues to handle the Vietnam issue from a position of so-called strength, he said, you must be aware of the fact that the time may come when the North Vietnamese will no longer refuse to ask some of their allies and friends to assist them. Well, I knew that had gone too far, and I said, that threat doesn't frighten me a bit, but go ahead and make it. And then he backed down and says, well, I didn't intend it as a threat. I was simply stating what the facts might be. Well, after this had gone on for about an hour, and I was just listening and not reacting, I decided we ought to break the momentum just a little bit. And they were all smoking. I think they were all smoking, at least. And they used to always offer their cigarettes to me. And this time I'd come prepared. I had a package of something called cigarillos. I don't happen to smoke cigarettes. Cigarillos with me. I don't smoke them either, but I pulled them out. They look like cigarettes, cigar tobacco, and offered them around. Well, that stopped the conversation because they didn't want them. They liked their own cigarettes. And so they thanked me profusely and didn't take them, but at least it broke the momentum of the conversation. But then they took it up again.
What, was there any result?
Well, the result was that I finally answered, and that ended the meeting. And the answer was very tough. I said, now look, you've talked about the fact that the United States is responsible for deaths in Vietnam and that sort of thing. You've talked about your standing by your allies. Let me say we're going to stand by ours. But let's understand one thing. I said a great American general, General Sherman, once said that war is hell. And I said, nobody knows better than you, the people of the Soviet Union, that war is hell after what you went through in World War I and World War II. But let me tell you the hell that you have been responsible for in South Vietnam. 20,000 civilians have already been killed since that offensive was launched on May the 8th. 20,000 civilians killed primarily by guns and tanks furnished by the Soviet Union. I said, now we're not going to tolerate that. Let's understand that right at the beginning. Then we went up to have dinner. That stopped the conversation.
Well, the dinner must have been uncomfortable.
On the contrary, it's just like Khrushchev. He was like Khrushchev in this way. They moved from a period of confrontation to negotiation to one of belligerence to total Russian hospitality. They had the very finest, as you could imagine, caviar and all the other fine Russian dishes, wines and so forth. We joked a little about Kissinger being there. Kissinger, incidentally, does not drink. Well, he just barely tastes it. Like any good diplomat, he knows that isn't very smart. And so I made my usual joke, well, let's be sure that we give Henry plenty of vodka so that, and Gromyko plenty as well so that they can work out the negotiations, and they'd all laugh at that.
Is that where you had the discussion about the relative merits of different kinds of dictation techniques?
Well, there was a lot of conversation at the dinner, just to give you an idea of the temper and so forth and so on. On rather personal habits and so forth, and I asked Brezhnev about whether he used the dictaphone. Now, as a matter of fact, the reason I asked him was that I was hoping I might be able to give him one as a minor state gift. We had already agreed to give him another luxury car for his collection of luxury automobiles. He says, "Oh, no, no, no." He says, I never want to use a dictaphone machine. He said, I don't like to dictate into an impersonal machine. And then with a little sort of a wink, he said, "I'd much rather dictate to a pretty girl." And he said, "Did you know when you wake up in the middle of the night and want to make a note, it's always very useful to have somebody there in the room to give it to."
What do you think they expected to accomplish from this triple teaming of you on the subject of Vietnam? They must have known that you were not going to cave under that kind of pressure. What do you think they wanted to say or achieve?
Well, first they were making a record. They were making a record for themselves and among themselves, each proving that he was tough. They were making a record, and this would, of course, they knew, get back to their hierarchy, for their hierarchy, that they were standing by their ally. They were making a record also for the North Vietnamese. I think that was the main purpose. I do not think that they had any illusions that they were going to change me, because they, after what I had done, ordering 3 weeks before the summit, knowing it would risk the summit, the bombing and mining of Haiphong, I think they were totally aware that no rhetoric, warm or soft, is going to change me.
What do you think they thought of you?
I think they, whether they liked or disliked is irrelevant. That's again one of the problems we have in dealing with the Soviets. We're so obsessed, we Americans, with the idea, does he like me? Am I handling myself in a way that will give him a warmer feeling toward me? And all that is it's nonsense in dealing with these people. These people are total materialists. It isn't whether they like you or not, it's whether they respect you. And I don't mean by that you go out and spit in their eye and swear at them and embarrass them and the rest. But in the final analysis, their decisions will be made coldly and objectively, depending upon whether they respect their adversaries. They'll push you as far as they can, but no further. And I think they felt that I couldn't be pushed around, but also I think they respected the fact that after our long negotiations leading up to the first summit, negotiations on Berlin, which were successful, negotiations where we got them to take their missiles or their missile submarine base out of Cuba and Cienfuegos, negotiations that kept them out of intervening in the war between Syria and Jordan on the side of Syria in 1970, and negotiations which got them to participate with us in bringing a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. I think in view of that background, they felt, well, he is strong and tough, but reasonable. And so having recognized that they weren't going to get something for nothing, they recognized that they had to give something in order to get something. And that was the basis for what I think were very successful negotiations, right for us and right for them as properly implemented.
H.R. Haldeman has written about talking to you about what you both called the madman theory, which you applied vis-a-vis the North Vietnamese particularly, that you as an inveterate anti-communist couldn't be depended upon not to do something extreme if provoked, and therefore that was supposed to get them to give concessions at the negotiations. Was that applied vis-a-vis the Soviets? Did they think that with your finger on the button you just might do something?
Well, apart from what Bob Haldeman has said, certainly that was Henry Kissinger's view. Kissinger felt that it was very important, not, of course, to think like a madman, but on occasion to give the impression to a potential adversary that you might engage in very tough action, and always to leave that impression. And above all, never to indicate, and Eisenhower used to say this, don't ever indicate to your potential adversary what you won't do. Don't say, look, I'm not going to put in forces, I'm not going to do this, you can count on me to do this and that and the other thing. Leave them always a little uncertain that if they push you too far, you're willing to take great risks. And my May 8th decision, my bombing in December, the bombing of December after the elections of 1972, while those were very difficult decisions politically, they were effective in bringing the war to Vietnam to an end, but also they were effective in establishing credibility with the Russians and any other nation that might want to test us in the international area.
Did you make any special arrangements for the dinner you gave for Brezhnev at the American embassy?
Not particularly special. I didn't think it was particularly special because, you know, we had a usual dinner. Well, we flew in beef from Kansas City, as I recall, and we had some California wines and that sort of thing, the usual thing, just as we had in China. We were making very sure we did exactly the same things we did for the Russians that we'd done for the Chinese. But when the dessert came around, it was one of my favorite, it was baked Alaska. And Brezhnev brightened up and he says, "Oh, the Americans are really miracle workers. They've learned how to set ice cream on fire." Now, I just wondered if probably they don't make baked Alaska too, because they use a lot of flaming dishes, but it was a nice compliment in any event, and our chef, Dela Cruz, was just overwhelmed by it.
From Moscow, you went on to Kiev. What were your impressions of Kiev?
Well, Kiev, of course, is in the Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have always had a history of not being pro-Russian. As a matter of fact, when the German armies moved into the Ukraine, and shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II, the Ukrainians welcomed them with flowers and open arms and so forth, and only because of the repression, which was very stupid, the viciousness in many cases of the Nazi soldiers, did they turn against the Germans, because they wanted to be liberated from the Russians, the communists particularly. But in the Ukraine, I must say Kiev was very different from Moscow. In Moscow, as we drove through the streets, there were crowds, but they were kept 3 blocks away. And the crowds were very unresponsive. They seemed to be fearful to come close at all. But every time you get away from the center of the Soviet Union, the political center, Moscow, it's a lot more free, to use that term in a broadest sense, in Leningrad, in Siberia, and certainly in the Ukraine. I remember in one of the streets he went through there were balconied apartments, and people, women and children and so forth, were leaning out of the balconies, waving their handkerchiefs and scarves and that sort of thing. There was really an emotional welcome.
Wasn't there a point when you wondered whether you were ever going to get out of Moscow?
Well, that of course was perhaps the most memorable part of the visit to the Ukraine, was just getting there. We went out to the airport. Brezhnev did not go on that trip because he was the general secretary, but only the political leaders were going. So Kosygin and Podgorny, the president, were accompanying me. And we got into the plane, and we were waiting for the takeoff, and there was a little bit of a wait, and Kissinger and Haldeman and I were sitting going over schedules. And all of a sudden, back into our compartment, walked Kosygin with Brezhnev, with the most woe-begone looking Soviet general, B-ribbon and so forth, I've ever seen. He was the chief of Soviet civil aviation, as I learned later. And Kosygin said to me, and Podgorny said to me, he says, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but we've got some engine trouble." And they introduced the general to me, and they said, "What do you want us to do to him?" And I said, "Promote him." And they said, "What?" And I said, "Promote him." I said, "Promote him for finding the trouble on the ground rather than waiting until we got into the air." Incidentally, we'd had a similar situation, now that you mention it, with Khrushchev. We went on that Moscow boat trip that we saw a film of here earlier. We were going down the river, and the pilot of the boat ran into a sandbar. And Khrushchev was furious. He gave that poor devil a look that I know must have practically frozen him, and he's probably out digging salt in Siberia if he's even living today. But in any event, I tried to play it down by pointing up something that had happened to me just a month before. I said, "Well, Mr. Chairman, don't be concerned about that." I said, "This can happen." I said, "I have a very good friend that happened to Miss Bibi Rebozo, who's a very good boatman, and he ran into a sandbar down on the Keys of Florida just recently, so it can happen to anybody. Khrushchev didn't smile one bit. He just made a snarly look at this other fellow. But in any event, we saved the life of the general and probably his promotion on that plane.
What was Kosygin like?
Kosygin, very intellectual. He was not crude at all, highly sophisticated, one who also understood business very well. He was the businessman of the group. He understood economics extremely well. I think Macmillan once told me that Kosygin was one who could be the chairman of a major
ICI.
Is that?
I think didn't he say ICI?
Yes.
Imperial Chemical Industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was Macmillan who once told me they said Kosygin could be the chairman of one of their big chemical industry complexes or something of that sort. He was a very cold fish in that respect. And also, I sensed that he, deep down, was at times even more Russian than communist, although a dedicated communist. I remember I sat with him, between him and Podgorny, as a matter of fact, when they took us to the Bolshoi, and we saw Swan Lake. And I was remarking to him what a beautiful building that Bolshoi was. And I found that this is one thing, incidentally, we totally agreed on. He compared it to the Canadian Center, where he had seen some ballet when he had visited Canada, a great modern building. Modern like the Kennedy Center and also like the Lincoln Center here in New York. And he said he much preferred the Bolshoi to it. And he also remarked that as far as the Swan Lake was concerned, which he had seen many times and I had as well, that the section he liked the best was the dance of the four swans in the second act. But it was a little byplay. It doesn't tell us any more than that he liked ballet, as I did, and Tchaikovsky, as I did, but also that he didn't like modern architecture, and I didn't either. So we had some agreement.
Didn't he tell you there a story about his meeting with Castro?
No, the meeting with Castro, he didn't tell that. He did tell me that story, but not there. That occurred, as a matter of fact, on the flight to Kiev on the airplane. And it's a fascinating story, I thought. He had seen Castro in 1967. No, wait a minute. Yes. He had seen Castro, he said in 1967, so it must have been then. And they had gone swimming in Havana at the great Varadero Beach, which is a long, one of the great beaches of the world, where you have to go out a long, long way before the water gets over your head. And he said he and Castro walked out through the waves, waited out until finally they were able to float, and the water was over their heads. And Castro remarked to him, he says, well, he said, we are now in international waters. And Kosygin replied, that's okay. He said, I know Johnson, and he's not going to do anything against me.
At the summit in 1972, did Brezhnev say anything about the Chinese, and did he refer to your trip to China, which had been just 3 or 4 months earlier?
Minimally. Not particularly surprisingly, however. It was in 1973 when he hit the hardest on the China initiative. But that's another story that we may get to when we get to that particular summit. But in 1972, he said very little. For example, he did mention it in that very testy meeting that we had at the Dasha, when he said that he made the point that what we were trying to do in terms of our offensive and in terms of our supporting the Vietnamese was, of course, to embarrass them on their China policy. Embarrass, well, forget that.
Do you think, although Brezhnev didn't mention China, do you think it was ever not on his mind for a minute?
Oh, absolutely. The reason he didn't mention it was on his mind very much, but he wasn't about to show any concern about it. having in mind the fact that we had just been to China in February. The only one passing comment, which was a theme that Khrushchev had used 13 years before, and which Brezhnev used again in '73 and again in '74, was a comment to the effect, just in passing, that we Europeans, as he put it, referring to us as Europeans as well and the Russian Europeans, we Europeans are very different from the Chinese, the Asiatics.
Did he make any references to the upcoming presidential election or to Senator McGovern?
No, not with regard to McGovern, but he made several references with regard to his hope that I would be reelected. He toasted my reelection. There was no question, first, that he believed I was going to be reelected. They follow the American polls closer than we do, and through Ambassador Dobrynin, who is perhaps the ablest ambassador who's been in Washington for the last 25 years, they get a very good rundown of what's happening in American politics. Let me say again, I don't mean that when he toasted me as the next president and he hoped that I would be reelected and all that sort of thing, I don't mean that he was doing that any sentiment. He didn't do that because he liked me. He was saying that because he thought objectively that I was probably going to win, that he was going to have to deal with me, and consequently, recognizing what he could do nothing about, he was going to make the best of it.
In his heart of hearts, do you think he would have preferred McGovern, or is there any truth to or validity to the theory that the Soviets prefer a dependable, conservative, anti-communist president to President Carter, presumably being the case in point, to a more sympathetic but erratic and undependable liberal?
That's a very close question. I know both of those theories. I think that at that time, in the year 1972, that Brezhnev did want a dependable president, one who could deliver on whatever deals were made, one that could carry the country with him. I think, on the other hand, there are times when the Soviet would welcome having a president who was naive, or at least they considered to be naive, one that they could take liberties with, and so forth. The difficulty with the latter, however, is that they know that the American political scene is a volatile one. It's a fast-changing one. And they know that the country may be dovish today and become very hawkish tomorrow. So I think that, generally speaking, the pragmatic men in the Kremlin prefer leaders in the United States who are strong, not belligerent, but strong, pragmatic as they are, and also ones that can carry the country with them. At least that's my observation, but it could be wrong.
What do you feel was the principal accomplishment of the first summit in 1972?
Well, the major accomplishment, of course, was the arms control agreement that we reached on defensive weapons and limiting the 5-year limitation on offensive weapons. Another accomplishment, too, and it's hard to know how much of a role this played in bringing the war to Vietnam to an end, but at least it helped, was in the last meeting I had with Brezhnev, his agreement to send a major Soviet leader to North Vietnam. I think what happened there was not that the Soviet Union pressed North Vietnam to make a deal, but what happened was that as a result of our visits to both China in 1972 early and to Moscow later in 1972, the North Vietnamese realized that their major supporters had other fish to fry with the United States. And consequently, they realized they didn't have as strong a support as they'd had previously, and that helped bring about the peace agreement of 1973, January.
The second U.S.-Soviet summit was held in the United States. How did Brezhnev take to his first introduction to American life?
Well, he is a natural politician. He handled himself much better than Khrushchev. Khrushchev came over very defensive with that inferiority complex. although Khrushchev would have been a good American politician too, perhaps at a different time. On the other hand, Brezhnev was very confident, very self-confident. He loved walking down the lines of people that we had out there on the South Lawn, shaking hands and all that sort of thing. And he particularly liked Camp David. I remember that we gave him one of the Camp David jackets just as a memento, and he insisted on wearing it all the time he was there. And after we'd gone to San Clemente, he wanted to come back to Camp David for a day or two because he liked it so much before going back to Moscow. You see, Khrushchev, when he came over, tried to go public. He went to, for example, California and was embarrassed by Mayor Yorty, and then he went to San Francisco and the rest. Brezhnev wasn't about to make that mistake. That's one of the reasons I think he insisted on staying with me in San Clemente and in Camp David. He never got himself in a position where he could be embarrassed.
Was it true that he wanted to go to Detroit and to Houston, but because of sorry.
Give me 5 seconds. 5, 4, give me one on the line. 3.
Is it true that Brezhnev wanted to go to Detroit and to Houston, but because of the fear of demonstrations against him, those visits had to be scrubbed?
There was some talk of that sort, but I didn't want any untoward incidents to occur either. So under the circumstances, I did not press the invitations that he had received in that respect. I think it was best to do exactly what he did. He went away with a very good impression of the U.S., and like Khrushchev, he was enormously impressed by what he saw on the freeways of California, which I enabled him to see in part by having him ride on the other side of the helicopter rather than on the place of honor.
Wasn't your position in Summit 2 was considerably different from in the first from what it was in the first summit? Politically, you hadn't been able to deliver because of congressional opposition on the Jewish emigration issue, on most favored nation treaty status, on some trade agreements, and Watergate at that time was about to burst. The Dean testimony was indeed the John Dean testimony was delayed a week for the summit. How much were you inhibited or constrained in your negotiations because of these political factors?
Those factors did not have any significant effect on those negotiations. Summit 2 was too early to have any further agreements on arms control. What we did get out of Summit 2 was an agreement to attempt to reach a settlement by 1974 on offensive weapons. And we had a general agreement with regard to the prevention of nuclear war, with a set of principles and so forth, which I think had considerable public support. But otherwise, I do not think that there was any significant problem there. It was at Summit 2, the main recollection I have of that from a substantive standpoint was the fact that Brezhnev made no bones about his concern on the Chinese issue.
In what circumstances?
Well, we were meeting at that time in San Clemente in my office alone, just the two of us, not with a lot of other people around. A significant point to make. I do not think he would have made that point with his other Soviet colleagues even around him. Only his translator was there, Victor, who of course was totally his man. And he said that he was convinced that the Chinese were a mortal danger insofar as war was concerned. He pointed out what others had pointed out in the Soviet leadership from time to time, that Mao had once said that they didn't fear war because you could kill 300 million Chinese and still have 400 million left, and he made that point. I then said, well, how can you really be concerned? He said, I've been to China. I said, economically they're very weak and they're very backward, therefore industrially and in terms of their nuclear power. I said, it's going to take a long time for them to have the power that you have that would be at all threatening. I said, how long do you think it's going to take? And he held up his hands like that, and I thought, well, what's he doing, surrendering or what? I said, how long? He said, 10 years. He says, in 10 years, he was saying this in 1983, they will be equal to us, or almost equal, enough to be a real threat. Well, of course, that's not proved to be true, but it did show what he thought at that time. And so he was urging, wherever possible, that we have a common front to control the Chinese danger, and particularly the Chinese nuclear development at this point. Of course, I didn't give an inch on that particular item.
Was Brezhnev wearing his Camp David jacket when you gave him his car?
Oh yes, yes. That was a pretty sporting event. We gave him this time a Lincoln. We'd given him a Cadillac. I think yes, it was a Cadillac in Moscow, and I think we gave him a Chrysler the next time around. So we had one of.
Were you telling him something, or?
No. So we gave him the this Lincoln he wanted to try, and so I got into the seat with him. The Secret Service were petrified again, because they don't let a president drive the car or anybody else drive except one of them. But in any event, we went around a one-lane road which goes around the perimeter of Camp David, and there's a very steep drive, and I've gone down it in a golf cart, and it can be very dicey if the brakes on the golf cart are not particularly up to speed. But in this case, he went down that hill about 50 miles an hour, and I was just thinking, my God, if one of the Marines comes up that road the other way, we're going to hit him. But fortunately, we didn't. He turned as we went around the corner at the bottom, because it makes a hairpin turn to go back up the hill. The car turned, squeaked around there, and the tires screaming, and then we went up the hill, and then finally came to a stop back up. And he turned to me and he smiled. He says, "This car holds the road very well." And I was just thinking, it takes something sometimes to be a diplomat.
What do you have any recollections